My name is Jessica. I have always lived in a small town in upstate New York. It is a quiet town where everyone knows each other and crime is rare. My parents moved here before I was born, and I grew up in a house where the door was always unlocked and evenings were spent on the porch with the neighbors. Everything changed last year when a stranger appeared in our town. His name was Jacob, and he immediately attracted the attention of the local residents. A tall, dark-haired man with cold eyes, he always looked as if he was hiding some secret. No one knew where he came from and why he came to our town. One evening, on my way home from work, I spotted him in the dark. He was standing under the lantern looking straight at me. My heart beat faster and I quickened my pace. When I returned home, I felt that I was being followed, but when I turned around, I did not see anyone. The next day, an article appeared in the local newspaper about the disappearance of a young girl named Megan. She was my classmate, and we often met in a coffee shop near our school. I immediately remembered Jacob's look and the fear I felt last evening. Megan did not return home that evening, and police began an investigation. There was unrest in the town. Everyone was afraid to go outside after sunset, and I was no exception. Every sound, every rustle made me shudder. A few days after Megan's disappearance, I met up with my friend Sarah at our favorite coffee shop. She was one of the few people I could trust. Sitting at the table by the window, we discussed everything that was happening and tried to find some meaning in this nightmare. "Jessica, you know Jacob, right?" Sarah asked while we were drinking coffee. "I saw him several times around Megan's house before she disappeared." "Yes, I know about him," I replied, feeling the cold seep into my bones. "He looks suspicious. Maybe we should tell the police about this." Sarah agreed, and we decided to report our suspicions. But when we arrived at the branch, we were met with skepticism. The police assured us that Jacob had nothing to do with this disappearance and that we should calm down. Time passed, but Megan was never found. The police did their best, but there were few leads. A tense atmosphere reigned in the town. People began to discuss the possibility of the existence of a maniac, but no one wanted to believe it. One evening, when I was coming home from walking the dog, I saw Jacob again. He stood outside his house and looked at me with the same coldness in his eyes. I hurried home, feeling my heart constrict with fear. At night, I woke up from a strange noise. At first, I thought it was just the wind, but when the noise repeated, I realized that someone was in my house. My heart beat even faster, and I grabbed the phone to call the police. I sat on the bed listening to the footsteps approaching my room. As the door slowly opened, I saw a shadow moving across the room. My body was petrified with fear. I tried to breathe quietly so as not to give myself away. Suddenly, I heard a voice. It was Jacob. He was whispering something incomprehensible, and I could not understand a single word. I could feel the sweat running down my forehead and prayed that he wouldn't find me. When Jacob left my room, I knew this was my chance. I quietly got out of bed and, trying not to make noise, approached the window. Opening it, I climbed out and ran to Sarah's house. Sarah opened the door almost immediately. She saw me in a panic and immediately realized that something had happened. We barricaded the door and called the police. When they arrived, Jacob was gone. The police began to take our suspicions more seriously. They set up surveillance on Jacob's house, but he disappeared. It was strange and frightening. He seemed to know we were following him. Days passed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching me. I saw shadows, heard footsteps, felt that I was being followed. My anxiety was growing, and I didn't know who to trust. One morning, we learned of another disappearance. This time, it was a young woman named Rachel. She was new to our town and didn't know about all the horrors that were happening around her. The police began a more serious investigation, but there were even fewer leads than in the case of Megan. Sarah and I decided to do it ourselves. We began researching everything we could find about Jacob. It turned out that he was involved in several disappearances in different cities. He always disappeared when the police started hunting him. Our discoveries were shocking. We realized that we are dealing with a very dangerous person who knows how to cover his tracks. But we weren't going to give up. We decided that the best way to catch Jacob was to catch him in the act. We devised a plan that included watching his house and setting a trap. It was dangerous, but we had no other choice. We started putting our plan into action. Every evening, we watched Jacob's house and waited for him to appear. Finally, one evening, we saw him. He returned home with a package in his hands and looked worried. We decided to act immediately. Sneaking up to the house, we saw him go inside and lock the door. We knew this was our chance. We called the police and started waiting. The police arrived quickly and surrounded the house. They went inside and searched, but Jacob had disappeared. It was incredible, but he seemed to dissolve into thin air. We were disappointed and scared. The police found several pieces of evidence in Jacob's home that suggested his involvement in the disappearances, but Jacob himself was not there. We realized that he is much more dangerous than we thought. Sarah and I decided that we would not give up. We continued our investigations and tried to find any leads that could lead us to Jacob. We knew he was somewhere nearby, waiting for his next move. One evening, I was returning home when I saw a shadow following me. My heart beat faster and I quickened my pace. When I got home, I saw Jacob. He stood outside my house and looked at me with the same coldness in his eyes. I knew I had to act quickly. I barricaded the door and called the police. When they arrived, Jacob was gone again. I was scared to stay at home, but I knew I couldn't run away. I began to remember everything that had happened in the last year. I understood that we are dealing with a very intelligent and dangerous maniac who knows how to play with our fears. I decided I wasn't going to let him break me. One day I decided it was time to act. I met with Sarah and we decided that we had to catch Jacob at all costs. We began to develop a new plan that involved more risk, but also a greater chance of success. We decided to use ourselves as bait. It was dangerous, but we knew Jacob wouldn't be able to resist attacking us. We prepared everything necessary and began to wait. One evening, when Sarah and I were sitting at home, we heard footsteps outside the door. It was Jacob. We knew he was coming for us, but we were ready. The police were there, and we hoped that this time we would be able to catch him. The police were ready to capture Jacob. When he got closer to the door, we opened it and saw his cold eyes. It was as if in a terrible dream. The police immediately tied his hands behind his back. Jacob didn't resist, he just smiled, which was even scarier. Jacob was wheeled into the station, and Sarah and I finally breathed a sigh of relief. But that was just the beginning. During the interrogation, he behaved calmly and did not show any emotions. The police tried to find out the whereabouts of the missing girls, but Jacob remained silent or gave evasive answers. After several days of interrogation and psychological pressure, Jacob finally surrendered. He confessed to the abductions and told where he kept the girls. Police immediately went to the location and found Megan and Rachel alive, albeit in terrible condition. It was a real miracle. The trial has begun. Jacob was charged with kidnapping and attempted murder. The court proceedings were long and intense, but in the end, he was found guilty. It was a relief for all the residents of our town. A few weeks after Jacob's conviction, he disappeared from prison. The police were confused and could not understand how he managed to escape. This caused a new wave of panic in our town. Sarah and I felt again the fear that never completely left us. Sarah and I started getting alarm calls and texts. Someone was watching us and knew our every move. It was as if Jacob had never left us. We were on the verge of a nervous breakdown and didn't know who to trust. The police began searching for Jacob again. They patrolled the streets and checked every suspicious person. We knew Jacob was somewhere around, preparing for his next move. We decided to use ourselves as bait again. It was dangerous, but we knew Jacob wouldn't be able to resist attacking us. We prepared everything necessary and began to wait. This time we had to be even more careful and ready for any unforeseen situations. One night I woke up to a strange sound. I felt someone standing next to my bed. My heart beat faster and I slowly opened my eyes. It was Jacob. His face was illuminated only by the moonlight, and I saw his sinister smile. I gathered all my strength and rushed at Jacob. We started to struggle and I screamed, hoping that someone would hear and come to help. Jacob was stronger, but I knew I couldn't give up. I managed to hit him on the head with the lamp and he fell. I ran out of the house and ran to the neighbors. They called the police and Jacob was arrested again. He was wounded, but still alive. It was our victory, but I knew that fear would stay with us forever. The police put us under guard. We were safe, but we felt trapped. We couldn't live a normal life and always felt Jacob's presence, even when he was behind bars. It was constant stress that wore us down. After a while, we started getting letters from Jacob. He wrote that he would never give up and would always look for us. It was scary, but we knew he couldn't hurt us physically. However, his words caused us psychological pain. A year after the second arrest, Jacob escaped from prison again. It was unbelievable, but the fact remained the fact. The police were in despair and did not know how he was able to do this. We were once again in the middle of a nightmare. We received new messages and calls from Jacob. He was watching us again and knew our every move. We were on the verge of a nervous breakdown and didn't know who to trust. It was like a constant nightmare from which it was impossible to wake up. We decided to leave the city and move to another state. It was a difficult decision, but we had no other choice. We hoped that we could start a new life and leave the past behind. We found a new home in a new city and tried to live a normal life, but the fear stayed with us. We kept looking around and felt that Jacob was somewhere nearby. One day I noticed a strange person watching us. It was like going back in time. I knew that Jacob had found us again. We informed the police, but they could not find any trace of him. It was like a game of cat and mouse. We decided that we would not run away anymore. We prepared for a possible attack and purchased weapons for self-defense. We knew Jacob was coming for us, and we had to be ready. One night, we heard footsteps outside the door. We knew it was Jacob. We prepared for the fight and were ready for any development of events. When the door opened, we saw his face. This was our last chance. We started fighting with Jacob. It was a fierce and bitter struggle. We used everything at hand to stop him. He was strong, but we could not give up. It was a matter of life and death. The police arrived in time and intervened in the struggle. They tied up Jacob and took him away. He was seriously wounded and could no longer resist. It was our victory, but we knew the fear would stay with us forever. Jacob was sentenced to life in prison without parole. We felt relief again, but the fear still remained. We knew we would never be able to forget the horrors we had experienced. We continued to visit a psychologist and work on ourselves. It helped us cope with anxieties and fears. We learned to live with what we experienced and find strength for the future. Over time, we began to rebuild our lives. We found new hobbies and friends that helped us move on. We learned to enjoy every moment and appreciate life. We decided to stay in the new city and build our future here. We found a job and started living a normal life. It was difficult, but we knew we could handle any challenge. We decided to stay in the new city and build our future here. We found a job and started living a normal life. It was difficult, but we knew we could handle any challenge. Our focus was on rebuilding and building a safe environment for ourselves. One morning, I woke up and saw a headline in the local newspaper. Body of young girl found in woods. This made me anxious. I felt that our horrors might return. Sarah also noticed the news and we discussed that it could be a fluke, but the anxiety persisted. A few days later, news about the found body appeared again in the newspapers. The police said that this is the second incident in the last month. The townspeople were frightened, and Sarah and I began to feel in danger. It was obvious that this was not just a coincidence. The police started an active investigation. They patrolled the streets and questioned residents, but so far there were no leads leading to the killer. Sarah and I tried to stay out late at night and avoid dark places. Reports of suspicious persons seen near crime scenes began to appear in the news. We became more alert and discussed how to be careful. Every evening I checked the doors and windows to make sure everything was locked. We decided to organize a meeting with the neighbors to discuss the situation and plan actions in case of danger. It helped us feel more united and confident. We agreed to be in touch and help each other in case of need. 2 more victims were found. Panic gripped the city. People became afraid to go outside, and the police increased patrols. The killer left no traces, and that scared us even more. The police invited us to talk. They knew about our history with Jacob and wanted to know if we noticed anything suspicious in the new town. We shared our observations, but could not provide anything concrete. Every night became a test for us. We could not sleep peacefully. We constantly listened to every sound. Any rustle caused us alarm. We tried to support each other, but the fear was getting stronger. The police finally found some leads. They found that all the victims were killed in a similar manner. This gave them reason to believe that a serial killer was active in the city. This discovery made the situation even more tense. The police released a photo of the suspect. Sarah and I studied his face carefully, trying to figure out if we had seen this person before. But he was a stranger. This meant that the killer could be anyone we hadn't noticed. The police began to put us under guard because our experience with Jacob made us potential targets. It was difficult, but we understood that safety is more important than comfort. We tried to live a normal life, but the constant presence of security reminded us of the danger. I kept thinking about how we ended up in this situation. We tried to escape from the horrors of the past, but they caught up with us again. Maybe we attract danger? These thoughts did not give me peace. We decided that we will not just sit and wait anymore. We began to study materials about serial killers, trying to understand their psychology and possible motives. It helped us feel more prepared and less helpless. The police installed surveillance cameras throughout the city, including in the places where the victims were found. This was supposed to help identify suspicious movements and individuals. We hoped that technology would help catch the killer. A few days after the cameras were installed, the police informed us that they had spotted a suspicious man near one of the crime scenes. He looked nervous and kept looking around as if looking for someone. This was the first real testimony that could help in the investigation. The police began to carefully review all the recordings from the cameras. They were looking for any clues that could help identify the suspect. Sarah and I also looked through these records, trying to find something familiar, but we didn't recognize anything. After several days of working with the cameras, the police were finally able to make a clearer picture of the suspect. It was the first real image of the killer. We looked at him again and discussed with the police if we had seen this man before, but he remained a stranger to us. The police decided to increase security in our area. They have deployed more patrols and installed additional cameras. It was supposed to help catch the killer red-handed. We started to feel a little calmer, but the fear was still there. Despite all security measures, one more victim was found. This caused shock throughout the city. The killer continued to act despite the best efforts of the police. This brought us back to the feeling of helplessness and fear. The police were desperate. They could not understand how the killer managed to avoid cameras and patrols. Sarah and I felt desperate too. We did not know what to do next and how to be ready for new dangers. Police appealed to the public for help in finding the killer. They distributed a photo of the suspect and asked anyone with any information to contact them. It was the last chance to catch the killer before he struck again. A few days after the appeal to the public, the police received several tips. People reported suspicious persons who matched the suspect's description. It gave us hope that we could finally find and stop the killer. One of the tips turned out to be especially valuable. A person reported a man acting suspiciously near the crime scene a few days before the murder. The police began to investigate this information and found new clues that led to the possible hiding place of the killer. The police found an abandoned building on the outskirts of the city where, according to their suspicions, the killer could be hiding. They searched the premises and found evidence that confirmed their suspicions. It was a real breakthrough in the business. The police prepared an operation to capture the suspect. They were cautious and prepared for any unforeseen situations. Sarah and I prayed that everything would pass without victims and that the killer would finally be caught. The operation to capture the suspect was successful. The police were able to detain the man without any casualties. It was a real relief for all of us. We hoped that this was the end of our horrors and we could finally live in peace. The police began questioning the detained man. He denied his involvement in the murders, but the evidence said otherwise. Sarah and I waited for the results of the investigation and hoped that it was really him and not another false lead. After lengthy interrogations, the suspect confessed to the murders. He spoke about his motives and details of the crimes. It was terrifying to hear, but we knew it was necessary to complete the investigation and ensure justice for the victims. The trial of a new murderer has begun. Sarah and I attended the meetings and tried to support the families of the victims. It was difficult, but we knew it was important to see justice prevail. The murderer was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. It was a relief for us and for the whole city. We hoped that this was the end of the horrors that haunted us. Sarah and I still couldn't fully relax after the arrest. One evening, we noticed something strange. A man was standing near our house and watching. We immediately informed the police. They arrived, but the man had already disappeared. After this incident, we became even more vigilant. Every evening, we checked the doors and windows, looked for suspicious persons in our neighborhood. The police increased their patrols, but this did not reduce our fear. One morning, we heard from the news that another victim had been found. It was a shock. Everyone thought that the murderer was in prison. The police started investigating again, and we were back in a state of constant fear. The police interrogated every resident of our district. They wanted to know if anyone had seen any suspicious persons or strange behavior. Sarah and I shared everything we knew, but it yielded no new clues. The police began to investigate whether it could be someone from our past. They considered the possibility that the murders could be connected to Jacob or his acquaintances. It made us revisit our fears and memories. One day, one of our neighbors disappeared. This caused panic throughout the city. The police started a search, but it took a long time. Sarah and I were shocked and scared. Everyone was afraid that she would become the next victim. A few days later, the neighbor was found alive, but she was in a very bad condition. She said that she was kidnapped and kept in the basement. This added gruesome new details to the investigation. Sarah and I understood that the danger had not passed. The police found out that the disappearances and murders are connected to a new person. It was a man who recently moved to our city. His behavior was suspicious, and the police started following him. The police set up surveillance for a new suspect. Sarah and I stayed out of the process, but we kept getting information from the police. It was a long and stressful period, but we hoped it would lead to an arrest. One evening, the police informed us that they had found evidence linking the suspect to the murders. These were items found in his home that belonged to the victims. It was a shock to us, but we knew that this could be the end of our horror. After receiving the evidence, the police conducted an operation to arrest the suspect. It was dangerous, but they acted quickly and professionally. Sarah and I followed the news and breathed a sigh of relief when we learned that he had been apprehended. After the arrest, a new investigation began. The police tried to find out all the details and find all possible connections between the suspect and the victims. We felt a little calmer again, but we understood that this was not the end. A few days later, the suspect confessed to the murders. He talked about his motives and plans. It was hard to hear, but we knew it was necessary to complete the investigation and ensure justice. The trial of a new murderer has begun. Sarah and I attended meetings and supported the families of the victims. It was difficult, but it is important to see justice prevail. The murderer was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment without parole. It was a relief for us and for the whole city. We hoped that this was the end of our horrors and we could finally live in peace. After the murderer was convicted, we felt relieved. But after a few weeks, the unexpected happened. New, terrible news began to appear in the city. Neighboring areas have also been victims of mysterious attacks. This time, the victims were not only women, but also men. The police launched a new investigation and discovered an ominous pattern. The attacks took place in places where previous victims had been found. This implied that the possible new maniac had a connection to or used the style of the previous killer. Police found some of the personal belongings belonging to the new victims near the house where the suspected killer used to live. This raised a new suspicion. Could it be that the killer had accomplices or that someone was using his methods? The police were looking into all possible connections to the previous killer. They interviewed people who knew him or had dealings with him. It turned out that he had several acquaintances who could also be involved in these crimes. Among the acquaintances of the previous killer were persons who had recently returned to the city after a long stay abroad. The police began to monitor them and check their connections with new attacks. During the investigation, the police discovered a new person who looked suspicious. This man had characteristics similar to the previous killer and often visited crime scenes. After careful monitoring and evidence collection, he was detained. After the new suspect was arrested, he confessed to the murders. It turns out that he was a student of the previous killer and was learning from him in order to continue the case. He dreamed of becoming as famous and feared as his mentor. The new killer was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. The city could finally feel relief. Sarah and I could focus on our lives again, knowing that we were no longer threatened by maniacs. Life was returning to normal, and we learned to appreciate every quiet moment. After the conviction of the new murderer, we tried to return to normal life. But after a few months, new alarming news appeared. In the neighboring city, new cases of violence began to appear, which were similar to previous crimes. This raised concerns that we may be dealing with a new criminal. The police discovered that the new attacks occurred in places associated with the activities of the previous maniac. One of the victims was found with items that resembled those belonging to the victims in our city. This hinted at the possible transfer or copying of the criminal's methods. The police began to investigate possible connections between the new crimes and our old cases. They paid attention to the details of the methods and locations of the crimes, which suggested that it could be someone who had studied old cases or even had accomplices from the past. Witnesses appeared who saw a suspicious person who often visited the areas where new attacks occurred. They described him as a middle-aged man with distinctive tattoos, similar to those worn by the previous killer. The police also began investigating possible links between the new crimes and criminal gangs. It turned out that one of the suspects was previously involved in illegal activities, which could be related to the motives for the murders. During the searches, new evidence was found that pointed to links between the crime and certain organized groups. This included special tools and records that could be used to plan attacks. The police found a suspicious person who previously worked in human rights organizations dealing with cases of violence. This person looked suspicious because he had access to sensitive information and could use it for his own purposes. The police began to follow the new suspect. They collected data about his habits and contacts, watched his movements and interactions. It turned out that he is often in contact with people who have criminal connections. The collected evidence allowed the police to prepare for the arrest of the suspect. They planned the operation very carefully to avoid any unforeseen situations. Sarah and I began to feel the tension again as we waited for the results. The arrest operation was successful. The police detained the suspect, and new evidence was found in his apartment, which confirmed his involvement in the crimes. This included detailed plans and records that indicated his methods. During interrogation, the suspect began to confess to his crimes. He said that his motive was revenge for personal insults he received in the past. His confession confirmed that the new crimes were part of his attempt to continue the case of previous maniacs. The trial of a new suspect has begun. Sarah and I have been following the process closely and hoped that it would help to calm the situation in the city. The court session was tense but necessary to complete the case. The suspect was found guilty of committing new crimes. He was also sentenced to life in prison without parole. This came as a great relief to all who lived through the horrors of his crimes. After the trial, the police conducted a reconstruction of the events to find out all the details and check whether there are still unsolved aspects of the case. They also worked to improve the security system to prevent similar situations in the future. The city received a new psychological support program for victims and their families. Sarah and I decided to join the program and help others cope with the consequences of abuse. This gave us the opportunity to use our experience for the benefit of others. Sarah and I continued to rebuild our lives and focused on the positive aspects. We found new hobbies, actively engaged in sports and volunteering. It helped us feel alive and happy again. We decided to launch a project that aimed to raise awareness of the importance of mental health and safety. The project included workshops, lectures, and support for survivors of violence. This was an important step for us in the recovery process. The project received support from local organizations and the public. People gladly joined our initiatives and helped implement the plans. It showed how important it is to have a community that supports and helps during difficult times. After the successful launch of the project, we faced new challenges. It was necessary to constantly improve the program and adapt it to changing conditions. We worked on it to ensure maximum benefit to the community. Over time, we have learned to look at our past from a new perspective. We understood that what we experienced was a part of our lives, but it did not define us. We have become stronger and wiser because of everything we have been through. Life went on and we were ready for new challenges and opportunities. After the arrest of the previous maniac, Sarah and I began to feel some relief. But a few months later, new crimes occurred in a neighboring town. This time, the victims were both men and women, and the method of attack was similar to the methods of the previous maniac. The police found that the new attacks occurred in areas where crimes had already occurred before. They began an investigation to find out if there could be any connection between the new and old cases. During the investigation, new witnesses were found who saw a suspicious person in the areas where the attacks took place. Witnesses described a middle-aged man who wore distinctive tattoos and often moved from place to place, showing a special interest in certain places. The police began checking the evidence and looking for possible connections between the new suspect and the victims. It turned out that witnesses saw him in areas where the victims often spent time, which raised suspicion. The police also started checking possible connections with criminal gangs. One of the suspects turned out to be a former member of a criminal organization, and his contacts could be related to new crimes.